Hello, everyone. I'm Monica Coenraads, Executive Director of the Rett Syndrome Research Trust, and I am talking today via Skype to Rachael Bloom, who is the Executive Director of the Rett Syndrome Research Trust UK. Welcome, Rachael.
Hi, Monica.
And thank you, all of our viewers, for joining us. Rachael and I have been discussing, cure for Rett syndrome. How are we going to get there? What is industry's role? What are nonprofit roles? What are parent roles? What can we expect? What's the timeline? And we thought that it might be interesting to our supporters and to Rett families in the US, in the UK, but around the world as well, for us to maybe address some of these questions and have a discussion online. So, Rachael, you first contacted me in 2009, and I got an email from you. We didn't know each other before then, and you expressed an interest in wanting to get involved with what RSRT was doing here in the States and wondering whether there might be a way to do that in the UK. Can you tell us a little bit about, what was it about 2009 that made you want to jump in, and what was it about RSRT that made you want to get involved?
Really, I think for a long time I felt very lucky with Amber, not just because of who she is, but also because she didn't seem as badly affected with Rett syndrome as other girls. She had quite a late onset and a late diagnosis. She'd maintained some hand use. She could walk really well. She ate really well. She developed seizures and some breathing difficulties, but they were manageable throughout most of her middle childhood, and it wasn't until her early teens that she really began to struggle. She developed problems with walking and breathing and chewing and swallowing. And one day I just kind of woke up and realised that we were surrounded by all of the symptoms that I'd worked so hard to rescue her from all of her life. And Rett syndrome was really closing in on us full force. I knew about the reversal experiments of 2007, and by this time it was 2009, and I started to wonder what was taking so long. And so I did some digging. And the more I read, the more I realised that treatments and potentially a cure for Rett syndrome weren't as impossible as they had looked when she was initially diagnosed in 2000. And that this is something that we might actually see happen in her lifetime, and if not in her lifetime, certainly in our lifetimes. And I began to think about the day that we see on the news that Rett syndrome has been cured and how that will feel. And I thought, I don't want to be watching that. I want to be part of making it happen. I initially approached RSRT because I could see that if we in the UK wanted to do something to impact the speed at which treatment could be delivered, that joining forces with RSRT was the most efficient way to do this. RSRT was and still is the only organisation that's purely focused on research, and that year 94% of the funds raised or donated had gone to the research projects. But what struck me most was that RSRT had a game plan. Many disease-specific organisations fund research, but RSRT was driving the research, facilitating the science with a strategic portfolio of projects, pursuing multiple approaches to delivering treatments and cures all in parallel. I didn't want to recreate the wheel by forming a new organisation and trying to find out how to do all of these things myself. I just wanted to make the research progress faster for my own daughter.
Well, we're certainly thrilled that you reached out to us, and I think the relationship that RSRT enjoys with the Rett Syndrome Research Trust UK is really quite unique. And special, and it's really because of that relationship that and because of the revenue stream that you've been able to generate, that we can take on more research projects. So beyond being the executive director of Rett Syndrome Research Trust UK, you also recently joined the board of trustees of RSRT here in the US. Congratulations, Rachael. We are thrilled to have you as part of our team. What do you think that means to your supporters in the UK?
Our relationship with RSRT has always been strong. Obviously, we share the same focus and urgency. And we've been grateful to be able to share the expertise and experience of everyone at RSRT as we've grown the UK organisation. I hope that this new appointment shows the fundraisers and supporters that their efforts are deeply appreciated, but also I hope it shows them that their interests, the interests of our children with Rett syndrome and related MECP2 disorders in the UK and Europe, are well represented through this more accurate reflection of the global nature of this collaboration. Fundraising is a vital part of what we do. Obviously, research isn't free. It has to be paid for with hard cash, so that's always going to be our main focus. But now, rather than just supporting the research financially, we're part of the decision-making process that drives the science forward.
Absolutely, and you're also, part of the discussions that we have. Not every call that the trustees make is about funding a project, but often, we're talking about strategy, and you're now a part of those conversations. Not just a part of them, but contributing to them as well. So we're thrilled to have you. Our board and our supporters here in the U.S. are quite impressed with the fundraising community that you've been able to put together in the U.K. in a relatively short amount of time. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about how you've been able to do that?
Well, I remembered when you and I first talked about launching a UK organisation, Monica, and I only knew one other family who had a daughter with Rett syndrome. That was only in 2009. I think things were...
I forgot about that.
Well, it was before Facebook.
Oh.
Really, well, Facebook existed, but people, there weren't groups and things on it. And I think that social media has really made an enormous difference. Things were really different. People weren't connected to each other. But overwhelmingly, I think that when we launched Rett Syndrome Research Trust UK, families out there were just ready for some good news, for some other possibilities, for otherwise what looked pretty grim for their daughters' futures. And I think, like me, there were a lot of people out there who didn't want to sit on the sidelines. And all we really did was make people aware that treatment does look possible in our children's lifetimes, and that it's okay to have hope that this might happen. And that we can all affect the speed at which treatment can be delivered by getting involved and fundraising for research. And most importantly, that whatever you can do, it counts. When we first launched Rett Syndrome Research Trust UK, one of the reasons it took me so long to get involved with research is because I didn't know what I had to offer, and I didn't have any money, and I didn't even have any friends who had any money. And so, I was looking for ways to get involved, but I couldn't think of anything. And I think one of the things we've tried to emphasize with this organization is that whatever kind of skills, talents people have, or even if they can do small amounts of fundraising, all of it counts, because it all adds up to the momentum that we're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. And not only is it about money, but it's also about talents that people have. People may be good writers. They may be good graphic artists. They may be photographers. These are all things that a charity needs.
Yeah.
And so we need resources, we need talents, and yes, we need money. And that's, comes from my having to write checks out to all of the various projects that we support at the end of every quarter. And in next week, I'm going to be writing out checks to, the total $1 million. And so those deadlines come every quarter. The money has to come in to be able to support those projects. So money is I'm very much aware of the need for money. But there are also other things that we need, people's talents as well.
Yeah, and I do think, though, and this is something that's been pointed out to us on a number of occasions by different companies that we've worked with, that really what we need to recognise is that part of what makes us successful is our drive and desire to effect change for our children, and our ability to engage other people with our stories and with the solution that we have that's, close to us. And I think that is what makes our organisation strong, the fact that the people at the heart of it care so much because they're parents, and that they then are putting that desire to do something into action by doing the fundraising.
So in 2012, the Rett Syndrome Research Trust UK transferred $500,000 to RSRT, and last year you doubled that amount. You transferred $1 million, and I'm curious what your goal is for 2013 and how you plan to achieve it.
Well, it's our financial year is quite awkward. It runs from July to June, so it's difficult for us to estimate in terms of calendar year. But in our first financial year, we raised almost £250,000. Second one, 500,000, and this year we're already on target for raising £750,000, which I expect will convert into over £1 million in the 2013 calendar year, which I know is when your financial year runs. So, and that I think will see us maintain a steady £1 million a year income. I'd like to do more, obviously. And that was part of our initial 3-year plan that we had to raise the charity's income to £1 million a year. And we have a lot of plans in place to help us achieve that, both in terms of community fundraising, events fundraising, and work with corporate partners and trusts and foundations. There's so many things that we want to do, and it's sometimes it's difficult with a low level of resources, as you know. But I'm ambitious about what we can achieve. And I'm grateful that every day more and more individuals and companies are coming forward to support us. And fundamentally, I think the most important thing we can do, and sometimes the hardest thing, but the most important thing we can do is just to keep ourselves focused on what it is we set out to do in the first place, and to keep focused on that thing that we've done well, which is to consistently deliver the vital research funds which will ultimately move us closer to treatments and cures for our children.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's so easy to be distracted and to move in a lot of different directions as you get requests from families or this and that. And I think it's it's very, very important to stay focused on what our mission is. And we are a research organization, and that has to be our focus.
Yes.
Okay, what do you say we talk a little bit about the science?
That would be great. I know that everybody has a lot of questions, and particularly we're asked a lot of questions here about the recent research allocations. You've just committed $4.2 million towards research in 2012, amongst which is a $2.2 million project to activate the silent MECP2 gene. I know that this is an approach that you're really excited about. Can you tell us why?
Yes, I am intrigued and excited about this approach for a number of reasons. And maybe I'll just step back for 1 minute and just make sure that all of our listeners are on the same page so that they know what it is we're talking about. As everyone knows, MECP2 is on the X chromosome. Females have 2 X chromosomes. Males have an X and a Y. And so females, girls that have a mutation in one of their MECP2 genes and therefore have Rett syndrome, have a combination of healthy X chromosomes and an X chromosome with an MECP2 mutation. Every female shuts down one of those X chromosomes, and it's a random process, so that you may have one cell that has the chromosome that has the healthy MECP2 that's turned on, and then adjacent to it, the opposite will happen. And so girls with Rett syndrome are mosaic. They have patches or random combinations of cells that have either the healthy exon or the mutated exon. So in every child, in every female with Rett syndrome, she has a healthy version of the gene right alongside the mutated version. And about half of those healthy MECP2 genes are turned off because they lie on the inactive X chromosome. So the key here is, can we find a way to reactivate the silenced MECP2 gene? If we are successful in being able to find a drug that can do that, in theory, we cure the disorder, as per the reversal experiments that Professor Bird showed us in 2007. Because his genetic engineering version of it was if you can re-express MECP2 at proper levels, the symptoms go away, even in adult mice. So if we can extend that to people, then if we are able to turn on the inactive MECP2, healthy MECP2, then we have normal levels of this protein and the symptoms should reverse. So I'm excited about this approach for a variety of ways, a variety of reasons. One is you do not have to know the neurobiology of the gene. We don't have to understand what MECP2 does. We just have to turn it back on. And just is a bit simplistic because it is rather ambitious. So not having to understand the neurobiology of MECP2 is an advantage. Also, we don't have to worry about dosage issues. There are concerns that too much MECP2 might be detrimental. And with gene therapy approaches, there is a risk that we might be delivering too much MECP2 to a cell. But if we're simply turning on a gene that's already there, and it would be under its own promoter, meaning under its own regulation, it should produce the normal amount of MECP2, and therefore we don't have to worry about dosage problems. So there's a variety of reasons I'm excited. Also, Ben Philpott, who received the $2.2 million award from us, he had a paper come out in December of 2011 showing a very similar successful approach to reactivation of a gene for Angelman syndrome. So there's a track record there. And he showed us that, at least in theory, it's possible. So we're funding a variety of labs to work on this approach. And, the screening is underway. And it is risky. We may turn up with nothing. We'll have to see. But it's the kind of thing that you don't know until you do it. You actually have to screen. And the more compounds we screen, the more chances of success we'll have.
I can remember once being at a conference where you were speaking and you were talking about this. It was a number of years ago and way before we thought about launching Rett Syndrome Research Trust UK. And I didn't know you. And I put my hand up and said, if everyone has a healthy copy of MECP2, the girls with Rett syndrome, if they have this healthy copy that's switched off, is it therefore possible that there are people walking around with a mutated version that's switched off and that they're healthy and that they, in another life, just by some twist of fate, they would have Rett syndrome? And you said yes, and I remember thinking, how awful that is. But it all sounds like so much like science fiction, or at least it did back then. But in reality, it is probably the most feasible way of curing the underlying problems with Rett syndrome, is it not?
It could be. And there are a lot of caveats, and there will be, if we're able to find a compound that can do it, there's a lot of questions that will have to be answered, some of which I discussed in a podcast interview with Ben Philpott that I'll direct people to, because for time constraints. But things like how many other genes does it turn on, and once the MECP2 gene turns on, how long does it stay on, and how many cells does it work in? Is it 1 in a million, or do we hit every cell? So there's a lot of there's a lot of experiments that are going to have to be done, but I think it's doable, and I think we have the tools now that can address this. Having said that, I think we have to also aggressively pursue all of the other approaches: protein replacement, gene therapy, modifier genes, because we don't know which one is going to work out, and it may turn out that we need a combination approach. So, I think it's important for us to have the resources to pursue everything that we want to pursue. We don't want to put all of our eggs in one basket.
And I think it's that way that RSRT is trying so many different ways of finding a solution for Rett syndrome in parallel. That's one of the things that attracted me and the other families who started Rett Syndrome Research Trust UK most.
I think something worth stressing is that there is no lack of approaches about how to potentially treat Rett syndrome. This is not a field where, we're kind of twiddling our thumbs and saying, oh gosh, we have some money, what are we going to do with it? Quite the opposite. There's a lot of excitement, there's a lot of approaches. It seems to be a disease that can be manipulated, at least that's what we are learning from the mouse models, in a variety of ways. So that's really good news.
So from one very interesting approach to potentially curing Rett syndrome to another, last year Jonathan Kipnis, arrested symptoms of Rett syndrome in a mouse model using bone marrow transplants. This caused a lot of excitement in the Rett community, as you're aware, but we've not heard anything for a while. Can you give us the latest on this?
Yes. So you rest assured that there is work ongoing. So as you know, bone marrow transplants are a very risky and difficult procedure. Before you can give bone marrow, donor bone marrow, or even the child's bone marrow, you have something called a conditioning regimen, which is a combination of chemotherapy and or radiation, and this can be really, really debilitating to a child and an adult. So because of that, we want to really do our due diligence. And so we are repeating the Kipnis experiments in 2 labs that are being funded by RSRT, and there's another lab as well who's redoing the experiments. And so we just want to make sure, that we wait until the experiments run their course and that they're properly powered, and that the analysis has been done very carefully, and then proceed with next steps.
Okay. What do you think the number one obstacle is then to curing Rett syndrome? If there's no shortage of ideas, is it just money?
Well, money's a big part of it. If we had more money, we could pursue all of our approaches more aggressively. But I think, it's also science. Doing good science does take time. And that's something that, as a parent, is sometimes difficult to accept because you just want to know why aren't things going quicker. But, science does take time, and good science takes even more time. And so I think it's a combination. I think it's a combination of resources, financial resources, but also understanding that good science takes time.
So one of the questions that I'm most often asked is, how much money would it take to cure Rett syndrome? I know you're asked that question a lot too. Recently, a study came out that suggested that the average cost of bringing a new drug to market is about $800 million. People are concerned that with next to no government funding, how will this ever happen for Rett syndrome?
Yeah, well, this is a question that obviously I've spent time thinking about, and I am asked this question a lot. That study that determined that it takes $800 million, and actually there was a subsequent study that said $1.3 billion, is not, there's been quite a lot of controversy around these studies. But the truth is that it's not just out-of-pocket expenses that are included in that 800 or the 1.3 billion, but it's also costs like the cost of drugs that failed in a particular pharmaceutical company, the opportunity cost of not taking that money and investing it. There's also cost of doing very, very large clinical trials for blockbuster drugs, for example, that are for common diseases. So there's a lot of things that are included in that are beyond just the hard out-of-pocket expenses. Also, it's difficult to validate that number, to confirm that number, because pharmaceutical companies don't readily share that kind of information. And also keep in mind that to some extent, pharmaceutical companies use those high numbers to kind of justify keeping their prices for certain drugs high. But in reality, I think the out-of-pocket expenses that it takes to bring a drug to market is dramatically lower than $800 million. And also, I don't think that a nonprofit like the Rett Syndrome Research Trust is expected to bear the costs of everything from the very early basic science all the way to having a drug that you can pick up at your local pharmacy. I think what we do have to do is to de-risk basic science programs until a pharmaceutical company feels that they can take over. Okay, so what we are trying to do is fund basic science, identify approaches, validate approaches, and get it to the point where a biotech or industry can say, okay, this is interesting enough and there's enough data here to suggest that this is a viable option. We're now ready to jump on board and invest our own money. And that's not going to take $800 million. In fact, I was just at a meeting where we were discussing these types of things with industry people, and a number that I kept hearing repeated over and over again was $30 million. So $30 million to bring one treatment approach and to do the preclinical work. So that's before you get into clinical trials, which can be very expensive. But $30 million for one approach. Now, of course, if we have 3 or 4 or 5 approaches, that's going to be multiplied. But I think that's much more of a doable number.
It makes me even more amazed hearing that. Makes me even more amazed that RSRT has managed to achieve what has been achieved with such a small amount of money. Can you explain why RSRT is so well placed to spend the money that you do receive wisely?
I will. Before I answer that question, I just want to back up 1 minute and comment on what you just said. I think it's true. I think the Rett syndrome field in general has spent money very, very wisely. And I think there's been a lot of momentum from identifying the gene in 1999 to animal models to the reversibility to having some treatment approaches and strategies with a very small amount of money. And I think that speaks quite highly of the researchers and the nonprofits involved. And the bit of money that does come from government. So I think, this is a big advantage for us. I think we can say to biotech and industry and venture capitalists and philanthropists that, this is a field where a little bit of money has gone a long way. Imagine what we could do with more. The other thing I just want to touch on, Rachel, before I answer your next question, is that we are entering an era right now, a golden era for rare disease. Pharmaceutical companies and biotech firms have recognized that the likelihood of blockbuster drugs like statins and like Prozac and Viagra, all the low-hanging fruit has been plucked. And a lot of those drugs now are coming off of patents, and they're going to be losing revenue stream because generics are going to be coming on the market. And so they're kind of asking themselves, where are we going to go next? And for many of them, the answer is to rare diseases. Oftentimes, the science is better understood in rare diseases, especially for diseases like Rett syndrome that have a genetic, known monogenic cause, one gene disorder. There are financial incentives, patent protection, accelerated approvals at the FDA, orphan drug status for drugs. So there's a lot of regulatory incentives. Also, the cost of doing clinical trials is much cheaper because you've got much smaller patient populations. So you don't have to do trials of thousands and thousands of people. We're talking about very small populations. So the costs are cheaper. And so there's a lot of reasons why pharmaceutical companies are taking notice. So I think this is a really huge opportunity for Rett syndrome. And in fact, Rett syndrome has been getting a lot of attention from pharmaceutical companies. I have spoken to more representatives, more executives from biotech and industry in the last 6 months than in the past 15 years put together. So I think this all, it bodes well. Now, to answer your question, why do I think we're well suited? Well, as I've learned over the years, not only is it extremely difficult to raise money, but it's also really difficult to figure out how to spend it wisely. There's a lot of risk in science. It's research, after all. It's inherently risky. And what we try to do is minimize that risk. But for people that are kind of haphazardly trying to figure out where to spend money, where to put their money, the chances of wasting resources is really quite high. And so there's there's a lot of things that you have to know. You first of all, you have to understand the research landscape. You have to know who's doing what. You have to stay abreast of the literature. That takes a lot of time. You have to understand how to do peer review. How are you going to evaluate the projects that are submitted? How are you going to prioritize them? The ones that you do end up funding, how are you going to monitor them? How are you going to evaluate them? There's a lot of pieces that you have to keep track of. And it's not just enough to have scientific advisors. Yes, I would be nowhere without our advisors who have mentored me and give feedback. But the organization itself at times has to take a stand and has to drive the science where it wants it to go. It's not enough to just sit back, put out an RFP, request for proposal, and wait for proposals to come in. You actually have to set the research agenda. You have to drive the science. The X and activation projects are a key example of this. This was an area that nobody wanted to get into years ago, and every time I would mention it, I would, honestly, I'd get laughed at. Talk about science fiction. People would just look at me very strangely. But now, 5-6 years later, this is a viable option that people are interested in, that scientists think is doable. So, it requires knowing the field enough and speaking with enough people, but also having our own opinion about things and pushing those. And that's, that doesn't happen overnight. That's something that takes years to develop. The other thing is you have to have an extensive network. You have to know the neuroscience community, the biochemistry community, the genetics community, to be able to identify people that are doing synergistic things and try to recruit them into the field. When you organize a meeting, to have well-balanced, perspectives, not just from the Rett field, but from outside the Rett field as well. It's really important to do that. When you're doing peer review on a project, you have to understand, who really knows about this project, who's an expert at this area. What about conflict of interest? What about personalities? All those kinds of things weigh into a peer review, and you have to be aware. And that, again, doesn't happen overnight. You have to know the community. So spending money on science is not easy. There's a lot of nuances, and certainly I'm not naive. We're not making any guarantees that, fund RSRT and we'll get you the cure. But I think that what we can guarantee is that we really do our due diligence.
I think one of the things that I only realised when we started to work together was how many different people's interests you're managing through this work. So the scientists who all have their own agenda, and the pharmaceutical companies and the biotechs, and I sort of naively thought everyone was aiming for treatments and cures for diseases, and I think that one of the greatest shocks that I had was when I realised that there wasn't a big they out there that was heading for treatments and cures for Rett syndrome and doing everything they could while I slept soundly at night. Really, I think it's RSRT that has that role in this field of keeping our solution at the forefront. And again, as we were saying earlier, I think maintaining that kind of focus is probably the hardest thing out of everything that we have to do.
No, you're absolutely right. Everyone, comes at Rett Syndrome Research with their own perspective. And, pharmaceutical companies, biotech, they have their shareholders' perspectives in mind. And oftentimes there'll be a program for a disease that's just, stopped for whatever reason. It doesn't have to be based on science necessarily. But sometimes it could just be a reorganization. A new division chief comes in and doesn't like that particular field, and boom, your program is gone. So investigators, scientists, all of us at the end of the day have the same goal, but how we get there and what influences our decisions can be quite different. And so a scientist has to worry about keeping their lab funded. making sure that their postdocs get first author papers, making sure that they get that NIH grant or MRC grant. There's a lot of things that preoccupy them. And as a scientist that's working on Rett syndrome, they kind of work in silos. I mean, they have their project that they're working on and their perspective and their biases. And they're not necessarily keeping an eye out for what everybody else is doing. So who's doing that? It's the nonprofit that's doing that. I mean, years ago I read an editorial that Michael J. Fox wrote on behalf of the Michael J. Fox Foundation, and he said people think that there's a department of cures out there. There isn't. Nothing could be further from the truth. And so there has to be an organization that's managing that and keeping our best interest at heart, which is our girls.
Yeah. And so if we did have a major breakthrough for Rett syndrome tomorrow, if, for instance, we discovered a drug that activated the silent X, what would be the next steps? Can you explain to the viewers how we would get from that kind of lab breakthrough into treatment?
Yeah. Well, it really, for this specific case that you mentioned, it would really depend on the compound. So say we are lucky enough that the compound that activates MECP2 is a drug that's already approved, that already has a great safety record, that's already been in people for many years. That would be quite easy. We would just go straight to a clinical trial. If it was a compound, on the other hand, that has has been in people before but has some toxicity issues, we would have to figure out, for example, okay, is this a drug that we could give once a year and the gene stays on? Or is it something that has to be given daily? If it has to be given daily and it's toxic, we have a problem. But at least we have a starting point. We would know the pathway that this drug utilizes. We would know information, and so then we would have to do some what's called medicinal chemistry on the drug and see if we could get rid of the toxic side effects. And so it's really going to depend on what we find in terms of how much is known about the drug and how much is known about its safety profile and whether it's already approved. But those are all things that can be addressed once we have those hits.
I think that the exciting thing, as well as the scary thing, is that you don't know how long it's going to take, and an answer could come tomorrow, and it could come in 10 years. And probably the only way to increase the probability of that happening is to continue to pursue lots of approaches in parallel and to make wise decisions about where the money is spent. And that's really all we can do, is it?
I think that we're going to see more and more clinical trials in the next few years of medications that are already used for other diseases that may have an impact on some of the symptoms in Rett. And I think that's wonderful, because if we can improve the girls' symptoms and quality of life while we work towards a more dramatic disease-modifying drug or cure, then that's all good. But I think the kind of cure that as parents we think about and dream about, to do that, I think you have to really address the underlying problem, which is the MECP2 mutation or some modifier gene. And how long that's going to take, I don't know. We could find like you said, we could find a drug tomorrow that activates MECP2 and that isn't toxic and that has a safety profile and answers all the questions so we'll have to wait and see. Science isn't linear, and oftentimes, the answers can come in very unexpected places.
Well, I would be grateful for anything at this point that would be useful for Amber, and I'm sure lots of parents feel the same. Since before Amber was even diagnosed with Rett syndrome, I can remember reading about you, Monica, and your efforts. We've both been around the field for quite a long time now, and different organisations have come and gone, but you have been the one constant in the field, focusing on the research, engaging the scientists, and driving the field forward towards our solution. We're not very big on accolades at Rett Syndrome Research Trust UK, but I really don't know where this field would be without you. I don't know where you get your stamina from, but long may it continue, and we'll be behind you 100% until we see treatment for our children. Thank you for letting us be part of this work that will make such a difference to so many lives.
Thank you, Rachel. My family, I think, would say that I'm stubborn, and that's why I'm still here. But actually, I think it's because I'm excited. I see that the research community is encouraged, and I think there's a lot of promise in the science. And I am excited each and every morning to wake up. I can't wait to sit in front of my computer and to see what email, what phone call, what paper I'm going to read, what connection I'm going to make, and what news I'm going to hear. So that really does keep me going. And my daughter is now 16, and she has a pretty severe form of Rett. And I am still hopeful that the science is going to help her as well as all of the other beautiful kids that I've gotten to know. And the ones that I'm never going to meet, but whose parents I've connected with. The other thing is I want to make sure that families listening to this know that they can get in touch with me anytime. Ask a question, pick up the phone, send me an email, contact me on Facebook. I'm happy to answer questions. If I don't have the answer, I'll try to get the answer for you. But this can really be an ongoing dialogue. And I also want to use this opportunity to thank everyone who has supported RSRT and RSRT UK. Your money is being invested wisely, and we are really, really grateful for your support. And we hope that in the not-so-distant future, we can come back to you and show you very tangibly what we've been able to do with your hard-earned money. Thank you. Thanks, Rachel.